So the final session should be quite a controversial and a lively one, which would suit for the final session of the day. So I'd like to introduce, we've got Leah, who's the Deputy Director for Research at Trends, and Scott, who's a non-resident fellow at Trends as well. You'll be talking about why we didn't intervene in Syria, and Scott, you'll be talking about US drone policy. So feel free to take it away, Leah.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So the paper that I wanted to write for this event was on humanitarian intervention in Syria and what this means for human rights. I'll try to keep the presentation fairly short because I know it's the end of the day. So I'll begin by saying that I think when thinking about why there was no humanitarian intervention in Syria, it's important to trace back at least the modern roots of humanitarian intervention. And when I say that, in the paper I begin after World War II. I look at the post-World War II era when the United Nations was formed, the World Bank was formed, the IMF was formed. It represented a normative and sort of an ideological point of view in terms of how global governance should be formed and what it was going to look like. So that was neoliberal economic development, that was human rights, that was democracy, these sorts of ideals, and of course human rights inside of that. At the end of the Cold War, there was another moment in time which Francis Fukuyama, as we all know, called the end of history. It was the triumph of liberalism. And that was a great moment for America, I think, in terms of being able to reiterate these global governance norms and to design what some call Pax Americana, of course, because it was uncontested. It was able to demonstrate what these values were going to look like in practice. And so when it comes to humanitarian intervention during the 1990s, at the end of the Cold War, I think that they were sort of imbued with more of a principled point of view. So of course the tradition of humanitarian intervention is not new, but it took on a value-based point of view, and human rights featured more prominently as a reason to intervene inside states. So if you look at the intervention, let's say when they intervened in Iraq when Saddam Hussein attacked the Kurds, if you look at Somalia, you look at Haiti, you look at Kosovo, for example, these are all cases of rights, human rights and democracy being caused, and also being considered threats to international security, which also happened, where the concept of what constituted a threat to international security expanded during this time. So what I want to look at in terms of the paper, and taking all of those as position statements, is why there was no intervention in Syria. And I make the case that we could have, when I say we, that the collective international community, and then without the UN, so it's even more problematic. So when I say we, take that loosely. But there could have been a coalition of states, let's put it that way, similar to what happened in Kosovo. It was a NATO intervention. So in the case of NATO, and I just want to make the point that it was possible to have the same situation in Syria, in Kosovo, the United Nations Security Council was blocked, and according to international law, states are unable to intervene in another state without its permission, by using force, without the permission of the UN Security Council. So because that wasn't possible in Kosovo, the United States, which led the NATO intervention, deemed it morally and politically abhorrent if they didn't go in. And so an intervention took place under the guise of protecting human rights, stopping a genocide, and upholding these liberal values. Then, at the end of that, came the R2P concept. So I'll just pause for a moment, talk about the responsibility to protect concept, which came out in the year 2000 as a reflection, called the Brahimi Report, of the humanitarian interventions that had taken place during the 1990s, and looking at a lot of the failures and what could be done differently. And what's interesting about the R2P is it represents a shift from a right to intervene in states for the purposes of protecting human rights and threats and preventing threats to international peace and security, to a responsibility. And that pivot, I think, is really important in terms of the value that was placed on human rights and what they mean for international security and the world order. So skip forward to 10 years and we go to Libya. A lot of scholars and commentators said that Libya represented almost a triumph for R2P as a concept. It was the model. It was quite a case to look at in terms of the best case scenario, because the Libya intervention occurred expressly because they wanted to protect against human suffering. It was a human rights mandate. So then moving forward and looking at Syria, if, in 2011, of course, what happened in Libya and the instability that occurred in Libya was an outcome of the Arab Spring events that swept the whole region. And so what happened in Libya also happened in Syria, it happened in Tunisia and Egypt and so on. But around the time that Gaddafi was threatening to was bringing all his tanks and going door to door and so on, and it was Security Council Resolution 1973 in March, I believe, of 2011 that allowed an intervention to occur. And at that time, there were less people that had been killed in Libya than in Syria. Yet an intervention took place in Libya. And so in my paper, what I do is I highlight some of the reasons why the intervention took place. And there's three main reasons. The first one is because there was a credible threat from Gaddafi. He had a human rights record that was very atrocious, and everyone believed him when he said he's going to go door to door and root out the cockroaches, which is a haunting similarity to the Rwandan genocide. There was also a winnability factor where his military was very weak and undisciplined and almost non-existent, so there wouldn't be a lot of difficulty winning that one. And in terms of the interstate politics, I think they underestimated the complexity that was actually there, and they thought that they could establish a post-intervention government, transitional national government, and that it would work out. And there was also something called redemptive politics, I think, which after the Arab Spring took place, the United States was widely perceived to have abandoned the region, to not have stuck up for, especially Mubarak. It was taken very personally. And needing to show engagement in the region, needing to show that they cared about democracy, and wanting to be present, to have the footprint that the Arab states sought. So the intervention occurred. And why did one not occur in Libya? Or sorry, not Libya, Syria. So this is where the paper becomes a little bit challenging, because it's difficult to discuss humanitarian intervention without the recognition of the contradiction. So on one hand, we have the recognition of the values of liberalism and what the normative global governance framework looks like, and the purpose of the United Nations with human rights as a core part of their strategy, which I believe you said earlier, while at the same time having the reality that real politics and realism are often part of outcomes, despite the normative values, despite the institutions that we have, and despite the aspirations of people and even governments. And humanitarian intervention embodies those contradictions. So I mentioned a series that did take place during the 1990s, but I didn't mention that, for example, there wasn't one in Rwanda, which is a classic case, right? Nor was there one in Chechnya. Every time there is a need for an intervention to occur, it doesn't mean that there necessarily will be. And so obviously humanitarian intervention is inherently political, just as the Security Council is political, which is part of the justification why Kosovo was an acceptable illegal act, because recognition of the political nature of the Security Council, they said, was appropriate. And not intervening on the basis of a political instrument, or the blocking, a political instrument being blocked, would be morally irreconcilable. This was kind of the idea. So in Libya, I keep saying Libya, in Syria, what I would like to say is, on one hand, I recognize the realism of why there was no intervention, and that when I discuss liberal values and human rights and these ideals, it's not without an understanding of the inherent contradiction and almost the duality of these systems that have always been at play. Yet, I feel that the consequences of not having intervened when we did go into Libya have implications. And what I'd like to do is to classify them on three levels: a systems level, a regional level, and then a state level. So firstly, just to go back, I think the main reasons why there was no intervention in Syria is because there was fatigue. in terms of what's called the rebound effect. So having had building failures in Afghanistan and Iraq, and then Libya turned into a complete disaster, the United States, among others, were just unwilling to try to engage in Syria. It looked like, somebody once called it, deep mud. Then there was, of course, also the geopolitical factor where the Iranians consider Syria basically to be another province. Under no circumstances would they allow any sort of geopolitical shift. Russia had a naval base there, obviously in Tartus, and deep geopolitical interest there that after Ukraine kind of morphed into something as well, which became almost a standoff between the United States and Russia in terms of worldviews again. There was a low chance of success because Syria is densely populated and also very complicated in terms of its ethnic and religious makeup, and also has a formidable military, which was backed by Russian arms and actual capability. And that was an important fact. Aside from the proportionality issue, which is something that R2P is a part of R2P, if you do more damage intervening and trying to help than what would have been done if you had stayed out, it cannot be justified. And in the case of Syria, that would have been the case. When an intervention occurred in Libya, there was very little opposition initially. I mean, it was incredibly easy to win. But in the case of Syria, it would have been an actual war. It would turn into a war. And it turned into one anyways. But had an intervention taken place even in the early days of 2011 or the fall of 2011, spring 2012, when it was possible, it still would have been met with resistance. And the coalition forces, let's say if it was NATO or just ad hoc coalition, whatever it was, would have found themselves challenged. So it wouldn't have just been a humanitarian intervention. It would have turned into, there's a variety of, I don't know what it was, complex counterinsurgency operation perhaps. And lastly, there's no post-war solution in Syria. Look at Iraq, look at Libya. These were very powerful lessons, I think, and a recognition that there's no solution, and certainly one cannot be imposed by the Western states on Syria. So that's a short summary of why an intervention didn't occur. And they're very realistic and pragmatic reasons, and they're not related in any way to the importance of human rights. But the outcome of not having intervened, I think, has implications for this global governance and world order. Some people say that the United Nations has been thoroughly discredited in the Middle East after the Arab Spring, after Tunisia, after Egypt, after Libya, after Syria. There's just no street credit anymore with the people. And the United Nations embodies a lot of the principles, these values, this liberal Western framework. The normative ideals of the world order, led by the US, I think, are also being challenged. And it's not just the UN, and it's not just human rights, and it's not just the concept of R2P. I think even the World Bank is being challenged, the IMF is being challenged, there's alternative institutions being erected, membership from the ICC, for instance, the Gambia, Burundi, South Africa, they've left, others are leaving. Venezuela left the World Bank, Ecuador wants to, there's recognition that an alternative framework can exist, and that maybe the multipolar world, which no one disagrees has emerged, is less normative in nature than what we saw under the US leadership. It was really only a 20-year period between 1991 and I don't know when, I think a date's hard to find, but this multipolar framework has been emerging for some time with the BRIC countries and so on, even earlier coming out. So the paper will conclude with just a reflection on what this means, what Syria means, because it seems to be a line in the sand to me. How can you ever come back from not having intervened in Syria and still credibly talk about R2P? How can we credibly talk about human rights and the importance of human rights to international security and peace when we know that not intervening in Syria led to one of the worst refugee crises since World War II? It has led to a flood of terrorists and extremists to the region, and then a flood from the region as well. So plus Syria, the economic challenges, the instability that was caused by this conflict is hard to overstate. So if there ever were a just cause, Syria was it. And the failure of the international community to act, for these realistic reasons that they did fail, but nevertheless, the failure also represents a failure of something grander. It has to do, I think, with a vision. So that's on the systemic level of analysis. I think that that the U.S.-centric world order has, that is liberal and normative in nature, has been maybe not discredited, but it's over. It might be the end of history, if you want to put it that way. There's an article in Foreign Affairs that used that term, and I thought, well, that's nice. And I think that it's true. On the regional level of analysis, the subsystem level, I think the same is true. There's a lot of, the U.S. pivot to the West as well has created a desire, especially among the Arab Gulf states, to look elsewhere for security partners, reaching out to even Russia and to China and to others, diversifying their security partners and layering the security approaches because they are hedging against the U.S. security guarantee, which is not completely guaranteed. And we'll see what Trump presidency means for the Middle East. But there's a cautious optimism underlined by a realism, where they recognize that they need to stand up for themselves and be more self-sufficient, which they are, but also diversify their security partners, which means that not only is the U.S. choosing to pivot away, so to speak, but that it happened by force, and that the geostrategic gains that Iran and Russia have made in the region aren't going anywhere anytime soon. Those are big permanent shifts. So that also has bearing on the world order, as well as with the U.S. as the the central policeman of the world. And then lastly, on the state level, of course, there's the Syrian people themselves. And what does the concept of human rights and humanitarian intervention mean for them? There's nothing to say about that, I guess. And the doctrine of human rights, what will the future be? And I think it's interesting because so far today we've been talking about countering violent extremism and the strategy of CVE as being more important than human rights, as trumping it, and that human rights are being compromised left, right, and center so that we can provide security, so that we can counter violent extremism. So it seems all around that human rights have just completely lost out. And I think that that's where the paper will conclude, because I think an era is over.
Leah, I've got an immediate question for you, and that's, what do you think the role of personality in the decision of non-intervention was? So
The
people
role of
around,
personality?
the role of personality, the role of individuals like Obama, was it all down to him? Because people around him, like Kerry, leaked recordings of him speaking with the FSA divisions. He's actually said that he was in favor of intervention from an early stage. Samantha Power, she wrote a book on why you shouldn't stand by whilst humanitarian catastrophes are taking place. People in Obama's inner circle seemed to be in favor of military intervention, yet he was very hesitant. So did it come down to his role as an individual, as the president?
I would say no. Of course, there are voices that will call for it. There are liberal voices and people who do champion human rights and so on. But there were a lot of credible voices as well coming out of the Pentagon and the CIA saying, you'd be crazy to go into Syria. We have no exit strategy. We have no money. There's no appetite in the United States, the public opinion, which is also a factor. Even when chemical weapons were used in Syria, I think it was only 27 from a Pew poll. 27% of the people supported any kind of action whatsoever. And in Libya, where an intervention did take place, I think it was 23% actually supported it. No appetite. I think the Americans wanted their people at home. They didn't want any more crusades overseas, didn't want to fight somebody else's battle. So although personality matters and that the president at the time matters, and Obama being kind of a disengaged foreign policy actor in the region, I'm sure that that's part of it, but I wouldn't chalk it up to him. I think there was more to play.
So you raised the issue of public opinion, and that itself brings up its own conundrum. So do these leaders then say that their foreign policy is dictated by public opinion, or do they say there's a case to be made and we can actually change public opinion in favor of intervention?
Neither. I think it's somewhere in the middle. I think
Okay.
public policy matters, or not public, sorry, public opinion. It matters, of course it does. It also depends where in the election cycle you are. But does it dictate foreign policy? Not particularly, I wouldn't say. There's a lot of American foreign policies that are unfavorable among Americans, but are non-negotiable.
Sure.
You know, people aren't consulted, and their views on it, in some respects, are irrelevant. But that's not to discount the influence of public opinion. Like I said, it is a factor, but it's not the factor.
Okay, absolutely. So, many more questions to come, but I think it'll be useful to hand it over to Scott.
Okay, thanks. I'm Scott Englund. I'm from, I'm a non-resident fellow at Trends, and I come from Santa Barbara, so I want to thank Trends for flying the 3 Santa Barbara contingent out here to sunny London. And thank you to King's for hosting us. As the first representative of the United States, I'll give my little talk, and then inevitably you'll just ignore it and ask me questions about what I think will happen when Trump becomes president. So here we go. I'm here to talk about the United States targeted killing program, and specifically its use of drones. And the technical people will say that they're actually called unmanned aerial systems or remotely piloted aircraft, or RPAs. So if I throw out the word RPA or the acronym RPA, that's what I mean, but I'll try to just use the word drone. I have, I think, 3 parts to this story to tell right now. The first is that drones aren't really new or revolutionary in and of themselves, but just how they're presently being used is what's new and interesting. The second would be to try to apply the current law of armed conflict to the use of drones, and specifically the United States war against Al-Qaeda and what they call associated groups. Actually, these are just those that committed the terrorist attacks of 9/11 and associated groups, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Mostly, I'll find that it's difficult to apply the law of armed conflict because the enemy is hard to define and hard to find. And there is no definite military objective of this current strategic, or this current campaign. And then finally, I'll try to address an answer about the effectiveness of such a program, of targeted killing or decapitation programs, and find that a definite answer on that effectiveness is in fact elusive. And then finally wrap up with talking about what is the effect, and seeing as this conference about human rights, the effect on human rights of what is essentially the United States conducting a borderless, endless war on a target that is very hard to define. So, that cheery topic, let's get into the RPAs, or the drones. Really, the remotely piloted aircraft, or drones, are about as old as manned aerial flight. The first one flew in the First World War. I also say that for an unmanned aerial system, there are a lot of people involved. In a typical U.S. Air Force RPA or drone mission that can last almost 24 hours, there's about 150 to 200 personnel that actually maintain it, equip it, monitor the sensors, analyze the intelligence that is collected by them, and then ultimately make command decisions about whether weapons are released. So there's a lot of people involved in that. They're not less accurate or more haphazard than their manned counterparts because they can loiter. They call it loiter over a target for a long period of time, and because they have very sensitive sensors. We actually found that they're more accurate in the way that they deploy their weapons. So that's another misconception. And finally, their use is just on the rise. And that not only just in the United States, but other countries, of course, use them. You can, in California, where you can go and buy one yourself. It's not, a Predator, but it's small, but it's still a drone. You can fly it. And maybe just one other thing is that they aren't a strategic weapon system. So this isn't a strategic shift. This is just a weapon system that was sort of like making a rifled barrel instead of a smoothbore barrel, or making a cruise missile over an unguided bomb. This is just another way that combatants have put space between people that are fighting and removing themselves from mortal danger. The use of RPAs, though, they don't and they cannot constitute a strategy in and of themselves. They're just a tactic. And so the use of that weapon system has to be evaluated within a strategic environment. And I'm going to try to convince you that there isn't a strategic environment because we haven't defined one sufficiently well. So anyway, so that's about the drones themselves. Their present use by the United States against terror groups, I think, evades a clear legal opinion. For my adult life, up until I had moved out of the house, I had to argue with a lawyer. My father was one. So I know clear legal definitions are what everybody's after in law, and I just don't think that you can apply that very clearly. At least international humanitarian law, or the law of armed conflict. And there's three things that we can talk about in international humanitarian law and apply it to the use of drones. The first thing is that the United States, it is the position of the United States that it is at war. It's been said repeatedly by both President Bush and then President Obama and President Obama's staff and his legal advisors at the State Department that the United States is at war. Al-Qaeda and associated elements, according to the United States, brought war to the United States when they attacked on September 11th in 2001. So the existence of an armed conflict is present. Apart from that, they say that those same groups, the ones that planned the attacks in 2001, are still planning attacks and would still carry them out if they could. So not only is there an existence of a state of armed conflict, but also the United States has the inherent right of self-defense and collective self-defense. So there's an existing war going on. The war is effectively borderless. I'm not going to read you the long quote from the current national security advisor that says that the United States can basically strike whenever and wherever it wants, and it doesn't have to each time make an evaluation of the imminence of an attack plan. That's the position of the United States. That's them. I don't represent the U.S. government. I used to work for them, but I don't anymore. The war itself does not have a definite strategic military objective. The United States Congress, immediately after the September 11th, 2001 attacks, passed, they have a long title, but the short title is the Authorization for the Use of Military Force. It's a resolution, an act of Congress that is barely 200 words long, that essentially says that the President of the United States, without specifying who, the only thing it does specify is that it's a he, ironic, so fun. So maybe if Hillary Clinton had been elected, then it wouldn't apply, but anyway. Basically, the President has the authority to use military force to attack those that plan the attack against us and any associated groups or individuals in order to prevent any terrorist attacks against the United States or its interests abroad. So any attack, any terrorist incident at all. So I would argue that that's an unrealistic military objective because you can't stop terrorism permanently, forever. All right. Right, so there are principles of international humanitarian law. The first one was necessity, saying that the United States believes that it is necessary to conduct war. It was attacked, now it's defending itself, so that's the principle of military necessity. Second one is distinction or discrimination, and that is that typically under IHL, humanitarian law, there are combatants and there are non-combatants. There are people that are in a fight, that are engaged in hostilities, and traditionally those people wear uniforms, they carry their arms in the open, they have command structures that are easily identifiable, and non-combatants are everybody else. They stay out of the picture. So international humanitarian law, as far as I understand it, was set up to protect those non-combatants. So sort of always the destruction and killing that comes along with any war. That was the idea. The United States and some others add a third category that is not universally accepted called unprivileged belligerents. So that is someone that would normally be considered a civilian, but while engaging in hostilities, so actively engaged in hostilities is the way that it's worded, they give up their immunity from attack, but they also do not acquire the other privileges of being a combatant. So if I'm in uniform and I go into war and I fight, if I'm captured, I expect to be treated as a prisoner of war, and there's lots of lists of how I'm supposed to be treated. I am immune from conviction for crimes under the law. So usually killing people is usually a crime, but it isn't in war. So I wouldn't be convicted of any kind of domestic law breaking. And then I would expect to be repatriated to my country at the conclusion of hostilities. But an unprivileged belligerent gets the worst of both situations. Not only are they a legitimate target for attack because they have engaged in hostilities, but because they're not in uniform, they don't do it regularly, they're not as part of a formation, they also do not acquire the privileges of being a belligerent. Right? So that's another United States position that is unique. Care must be taken to attack only legitimate targets, right? So that's the rule. So you have to be careful. You have to apply all the necessary or all the reasonable means to protect them. So then it comes down to the distinction between terrorists and combatants, or even terrorists and unprivileged belligerents. So terrorism is a clandestine activity. So we know that it's conducted in secret, planning is done in secret. The people that participate in it do it part-time. They don't wear uniforms. So it would be very difficult then to distinguish them as combatants. But then you have to ask the question of sort of what constitutes participating in hostilities. So in the paper I asked the question, so would preparing a religious justification for some form of violence, would that be participating in hostilities? Maybe it is, maybe it doesn't. So that's one problem. The last thing under IHL would be the proportionality principle. So she brought it up actually, is that you can't do more harm than would happen if you just allowed the thing to go on, right? So if you attack something, you have to use only that much military force that is necessary in order to take that military asset off the field, and any damage done that's incidental to it, to civilian objects or civilians, that has to be in proportion to the value of the target. Right? So you have to, one, determine the value, the military value of the target. So what am I going to gain by taking that out of the fight? And two, then, what is the collateral damage possibility? And I'm saying that is difficult to measure when the overall strategic objective of the action is unknown. So how can I make a good determination of the military value of something if I don't know what the overall military strategic objective is? Right? So I can't know for sure. I can make a guess at it. And then finally, the US military actually says that only looking at tactical advantage, and this is in their manual on war, sort of the law of war, says that only looking at tactical advantage out of context generally prolongs fighting. Right? So if you only consider the tactical advantage of attacking a target, you're usually going to prolong conflict, which incidentally prolongs the suffering of civilians that happen to get in the way, unfortunately. I'll briefly get into the problem. There's a special problem of signature strikes that are done by drones in the United States, and maybe it's an unknown topic to you. A signature strike is an attack where the actual identity of those that are targeted is unknown, but rather that a pattern of behavior suggests to the operators in connection with intelligence that gathered through other means that those individuals or that vehicle or that building is associated with a terror group. But the people inside the building or in the truck, their identities are not specifically known. So of course that brings up some problems with international humanitarian law, namely distinction. If you're supposed to take every reasonable effort to avoid targeting civilians, then it's hard to do if you don't know their names or specifically who they are. It's difficult anyway, it's problematic. Proportionality, it's difficult to know what military advantage could be gained if you don't know really exactly what's going on the ground. Right? So that's difficult. And then of course there's just a lack of transparency. So that leaves us, if we can't apply law and it doesn't work out or it's problematic to apply law in this case, then what are the costs and benefits of the use of these systems? So quickly, the efficacy of high-value targets, of decapitation, targeted killing programs, is not entirely settled. If you read the literature that's been presented very recently in the past year, it's all over the place. It's effective, it's good, and it works. It doesn't work at all. We should never do it again, sort of a thing. Or we can't apply this. The cases are so different, and the measurement of success is so varied that we can get no meaningful conclusion about the efficacy of these things. So you do it case by case, or you avoid that altogether and just talk about the ethics of the thing. And that's the argument on efficacy. So that could be a benefit. So if it's efficient, if it's effective, then that's a benefit. The cost, you could say, is that, well, what was the effect on public opinion in the area where these things operate? So, like for instance in Pakistan, it's an area where there isn't an active war, active hostilities going on, but the United States nevertheless uses RPAs or drones to execute targets in that country. And there's a whole other discussion on that I won't get into, but so again, the research is mixed on that. So some say, well, yeah, it has no negligible effect, or it has an effect, but it doesn't last for very long, or the trend is down. I think the best sort of conclusion is that drones and the drone strikes can be considered part of the problem, but with public opinion, just like anything, it's complex. And it may be emblematic of the United States counter-terror program, so that there's a quote from a U.S. ambassador in Pakistan that said, unfortunately, these drones have become the face of U.S. foreign policy in Pakistan. And that's not so good. So that could be a problem. And I think it's legitimate that the United States should consider that as a cost. I published a paper on that actually the American public is attuned to costs like souring of diplomatic relationships, ruining of U.S. reputation. The American public is attuned to it, and they don't like it when it happens. So policymakers can consider that as a cost. So to conclude, what is it that we get with an essentially borderless, endless war? I think what we have is that you've taken the tactic, you've taken a good tool that can be used in war, and now you've substituted that for a strategy. The United States doesn't have an overall strategic military objective in the use of this weapon system, so it's very difficult to evaluate. I think that largely we're missing in the evaluation of this, and as policymakers are missing the cost calculation. So what is the cost in public opinion in these? I think just to reach way back to this morning from Sir David's talk, is that what do we want to risk? What risk to our values are we willing to take in order to employ an effective strategy or effective tactic? I think that's an important question to ask of this. And I think you can include it in any question of proportionality. So what is the damage that we can cause to our own values and the values that we express outside of the West or the people that are trying to counter terrorism? And what is the damage done to reputation? So with that, I think we'll just
Okay. Just before I open it up to the audience, I've got one tangential question. So when you look at how drones have been used in the Syrian civil war, you've seen that they're used to direct troop movements, produce propaganda, and even hone in artillery so that it's very precise. And people have now seen examples of suicide drones. Do you think that this is the future of drone warfare?
Well, yeah, I think so. I mean, the use of drones as a surveillance tool was how they got started. So being able to put eyes over the ridge, sort of a thing, to direct artillery or direct troops. And I think that more countries are using them, and I think that's a perfectly legitimate use of drones, or RPAs. But I think that just because Just because we have access to a technology doesn't mean that the bad guys aren't going to have access to that technology and be able to deploy it in their own lethal way.
Okay, fair enough. So, does anyone have any comments or questions relating to non-intervention in Syria and American drone policy? Yep, got a question over here to begin with.
Thank you very much. I've worked in Yemen, in Pakistan, and certainly my experiences there would lead me to suggest that the US doesn't really have a strategy, but that the international organizations, and I'm thinking here on development and so on, are in those countries are really in Alice in Wonderland. They really are very divorced from the realities of the situation. My question is specifically about the first comments on responsibility to protect. I noticed you made no mention of European policy. I'm particularly interested in the bit about how the Gulf states are starting to hedge their bets, perhaps with Russia and China. Is the fact that you didn't mention European policy, is that because you are a very polite person and don't wish to speak ill of the dying or the seriously ill? Thank you.
Okay.
To be diplomatic, mainly. They're just not an actor at this stage.
Many of them have a serious problem with the United States. I observed some colleagues from European countries rather indifferent response to the loss of the Columbia Space Shuttle. And when I mentioned that a few years later to a European Commission person, his comment was, but the Space Shuttle wasn't a European program. It's really quite a shock.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any other comments about the topics we've discussed? Yep, just got one at the front.
So I guess this is more of a question for Scott about drones. What do you see as the way forward for Trump's policy on that? Because we have we have Michael T. Flynn and we have James Mattis now nominated as potential high-ranking people within the military. What sort of implications for policy do you see there?
They'll be used more. I think it's a good guess. I would try to predict the unpredictable. The military. The comment about the military officers, the general officers, is interesting because I had a quote in the paper that I won't bother to read you. Is that Stanley McChrystal, who was also, he's not considered for a post or anything, but he's a lieutenant general, Army lieutenant general, special forces officer. He recognizes, because he'd been in the countries where they're used, and said, I'm scared of these things because of the way people react to them, not because they're ineffective or they're immoral, but because people just viscerally hate these things and they hate us as a result of it. So just because they're military officers doesn't mean that they're going to just grab the biggest stick in the closet and use it. But
yeah,
I mean, just to follow up on that in a way, and a question for both of you. I mean, Scott, you talked about a domestic policy to provide national security being projected overseas. And Leah, you talked about an absence of a policy to engage in a humanitarian situation. I wonder if both of you could comment on, is there any thinking, is there any strategy about these foreign policy decisions regarding the human security element at home and the impact of both action and inaction is going to have on sort of the domestic scene, and do governments think this through?
Well, I think the governments think them through. I think that the U.S. public opinion is that drones are a safe and effective means of doing counterterrorism without risking U.S. personnel. And so the approval for them is relatively high in the United States. It's the only place in the world that is. So that is a problem of perception. Is that you have two problems of perception. One is the problem that everything the United States does is now being judged by this very bad program that they've done, or that's a negatively perceived program abroad. But then at home, you have just this big overwhelming support for that same program. So you're kind of in a sticky situation if you're a domestic politician.
It's hard, I'm from Canada. I mean, I cannot speak for Canadians. I mean, that's a very good question, and it's difficult to answer. On the balance, would Canada say that we should, there should have been some version of a humanitarian intervention that stopped the conflict? Should they have used incredible force if needed to do so, which would have been required? Would they have support to that? I'd be inclined to say yes, I guess, because I think human rights and even the concept of R2P is in part Canadian. It was Lloyd Axworthy who came up with this, and the principles and the values of Canadians are such that I think more than, let's say, the United States, but it's hard to say more, but I would say on the balance, if Canada had to weigh in, they would say a forcible action in support of human rights, to prevent gross violations to human rights, to stem these wider conflicts. I don't think anyone saw Syria becoming what it became and how destabilizing it would be, and the sort of what happened. I don't think anyone saw that coming, because if they had, I'm sure action would have taken place. But it's hard to say, on the balance, I'm not sure.
So as a follow-up to this then, what do you think the long-term consequences of public opinion in the Arab world will be of American and Western non-intervention in Syria, if in the future they try to intervene in another country, in another situation?
I think the whole concept has proven to be so political that it's hard to credibly talk about it. It's almost that they need to write another version of a report, rename it, call it something else, recognize the failures, recognize the politicization of it, the shortcomings. But in terms of using human rights as the means to justify the ends, I think that you can't do it credibly, not after Syria.
Do you think misinformation or disinformation campaigns about the Ghouta chemical attacks and so on had any impact on Western non-intervention?
I think at the end of the day, there was evidence that those chemical attacks had taken place, even though that was politicized as well. And even that, which is the grossest of all violations when it comes to human rights and violating the Geneva Convention and the laws of wars and international humanitarian law, and everything had been, the just cause was there, and even so it didn't trigger a intervention. So, and the refugee crisis that Europe has, and Canada and everywhere, we've accepted refugees, and that legacy will live on of the conflict and the outcome and the decisions.
Sure. So we'll come to you, Harmony, and then over to you.
Thank you very much. They were really interesting presentations. I had a question for Scott. Do you think that the reason why that there is such support for the drone policies in the US, domestic support, is because in the end, within the domestic media, there's so little that's known about the consequences. So if it weren't for organizations like Every War Casualty or the Bureau for Investigative Journalism, no one would actually be going to investigate who was killed in these specific drone attacks. It's only small investigative peace-funded NGOs that are actually doing the work, and it's not being necessarily publicized very widely, I imagine, in US domestic media or press. So is it also just a question of knowledge that because it is something that is seen as successful but no one really knows much about it, then we can assume that it's successful and it's fine? While if you're looking at the Pakistani press before, or Afghanistan press in Afghanistan now, you get the much more gruesome details that you see as a result of drone attacks.
Sure. Well, I think that generally speaking, you can say in American public opinion that knowledge level does impact opinion, right? So it'll change opinions if they know more about an issue, and that politicians will listen to public opinion when it's a crisis, when a crisis is spiked. So the problem with the drone program and U.S. public opinion is that the problem happened a while ago. There isn't anything going on right now that's really drawing my attention, except that there's just sort of a background noise of fear of terror. So, but that there isn't anything. So now we're in the implementation phase, and so generally opinion and reporting and observation or knowledge of it in the public was way down. And so now, with a public interest very low, politicians don't have to respond to that. Right? So if you were to provide more information about the potential costs, not even in human terms, where you could say, it's ruining our reputation abroad. It's hard for us to do anything else in the region because of this. Well, then you might be able to shift opinion.
I have a question for both. A two-part question. On RTP, did it ever, beyond obviously NGOs and academics and so on, but on a state level, did RTP ever really exist as a a way of wanting to operate in the world? I mean, it's one thing to talk about where we effectively did act, say Kosovo, but at the very same time we're cozying up to the regime in Equatorial Guinea or wherever. Surely RTP is just window dressing its PR to justify certain things, because the very fact is, if without consistency, and I know politics is hard and possible and everything else, but without consistency, isn't it meaningless? Isn't law or rules only legitimate if they're consistent? So, and also, doesn't it delegitimize international institutions, NATO overstretching itself, well, going beyond its original mission of collective security? And although you might be able to justify it in Kosovo, I don't see how you can in Libya. And that then delegitimizes the idea of NATO that's seen as a tool of empire. And it makes it a lot easier to withdraw from it, as it seems to be the case from next year under a Trump presidency. So I think there's a process, we've been leading up to this point. Also with drones, I think domestic opinion is really important, and by not having body bags come home to prosecute this so-called war, because you can remotely incinerate people, I think it sets a really, really dangerous sort of example for the future. You have companies like Boston Dynamics who have the kind of robot supply. I don't think they're operational yet, but the idea is to remove the human element in the prosecution of these sort of battles, and that will increase. And we'll have occupations in the future where you have effectively a robot kind of checkpoint and so on, and that makes it very easy for domestic policy, to people to ignore that because it's over there. It's not us going over there, and you don't see it, as somebody mentioned. So I guess what I fear will happen, and we've seen with the police in the US in particular, is the use of military tools now against domestic protesters or just criminals. How soon before we're going to have drones? We already have, recently a police force, I forget where, in the United States used a remote control bomb to take out a hostage taker, I think, and surely we're going to see domestically police using drones against civilian populations.
Thank you. So first, Leah, on the question of the inconsistency of RTP.
Okay, I think you struck at the heart of the issue and the challenge also of writing the paper. Because I think on one hand, to walk away from even the discourse of human rights, or to say it's over, it's not important, it's the end of the era, that is harmful. We should keep talking about human rights. We should keep caring about them. We should keep advocating for their role in the international order, however that looks like. Maybe in the future when, China has a bigger role, human rights won't be talked about in the same way that we're talking about them now. Nevertheless, despite the importance, yes, it's true that the inconsistency, even before R2P, after R2P, it does show the politicization of it and the selectivity. A tool of the empire, the NATO, you say, or even the United Nations Security Council, the World Bank, the IMF, these are all tools of the empire to maintain and sustain its power and to selectively choose what constitutes a threat to international security and what doesn't. And this is just the system of politics from a very realist point of view. So I would agree with you that inconsistency has invalidated it. Was R2P ever practiced? I would say in Libya, yes. The initial reason for going into Libya, I think, was R2P in its glory days. It was short-lived, but it genuinely was. Let's just stop these people from being killed by this horrible dictator. It became regime change, after the aerial bombardments took place, and it became something else. But it didn't start that way, and so there is something to be said about that resolution to go in.
Ironically, it was sort of more French-led than anyone else at the time,
and
it wasn't the US seemed to be quite reluctant in that.
And Qatar and the UAE participated in it. It was important for a lot of reasons. But in the end, what happened? The failed state resulted. Russia was alienated. There was a line drawn that had bearing on Syria. So, yeah, political.
Scott, a question on whether drones are more palatable or if you're going to see drones over Brooklyn anytime soon.
Well, first, one thing is I don't think that it comes to mind that when the crossbow was invented, that the Pope at the time put out a bull that said that it was this evil weapon that should never be used because it put so much distance between the person that fired the bolt and the target that unfortunately received it. That because of that dehumanization, he said, that basically that it should never be used. And every time we've had an invention like that, there's a similar argument that this thing has finally changed war to such a point that it's going to be mass slaughter forever. And I don't think that that's going to happen. Because one, I have a real strong faith in the operators of the aircraft, because there is a person making a decision about the release of weapons, as it is now, and I don't think you're going to see that change. I know that
it is changing. I read a few days ago they're creating some sort of Siri-like system because the operators were getting PTSD from feeling guilty about pressing buttons, so now they ask Siri to do it. It's a disconnect.
Well, I guess I haven't read that, and everybody that I've talked to and read about is that the United States Air Force says that Air Force pilots fly Air Force airplanes, and they're the ones, and people make decisions on release of weapons, and so that's a position now. And I don't really, knowing a lot of people that fly airplanes and conduct combat, is that they don't want to have that change. So that's one thing. Drones over Brooklyn? I don't know. The case that you're talking about is that was the police shooting in Dallas. Was that the guy was essentially behind a barricade. He had already killed, I think, 5 or 6 police officers, and he was still armed and still actively shooting. So they sent in this little robot that was remote controlled, and they blew up, was basically a small grenade and killed him. But we do that already in combat situations. Yeah, but
we're creating that's the same way of doing things, that military way of doing things on a domestic. It's like police was having APCs now, or the SWAT teams or something.
Yeah, so it happens, and I think that it happens in limited situations, and I think that it's just not. I guess I'm not as concerned about it as maybe you are.
Okay, so we've got a question over this side, and then we can come over to you.
Yeah, I think my question concerns primarily the 2013 situation, and whether you consider that it was too late actually to make a big difference, and that maybe influenced the decision. It certainly would appear to have been an individual's decision, although that's sort of historical speculation. The president walked into the garden and then came back and told Congress, the Secretary of State, France, the Navy, the Air Force, no, don't think we'll bother with this after all. So there is an element there, but of course where Obama was coming from, the whole history of Iraq and the rest of it is part, so we can't just put the blame on him. But I think what seems to be overlooked and struck me at the time is just how much what was happening in Syria was part of a global game which America was on the verge of losing, or the liberal order was on the verge of losing, and as you say, and now appears to be lost, because there were things going on in Ukraine, there were things going on in relation to negotiations with Iran, where the US wanted Russia to deliver something in relation to that. Whether that will survive, I don't know. But as a world leader in Washington, it seemed to me that nobody was aware that the world game was changing. And to me, the turning point was the day that the decision not to take the action which had been virtually announced by Kerry and Powell 48 hours before. But the moment in which the president of the Russian Federation chose to address the liberal international world order via the pages of the New York Times, could say, "Wake up, America, the world has changed, we don't need your American exceptions anymore." And if I may say so, since then all hell has broken loose, because he's sensed the weakness and he's seizing the opportunity. Now, whether Trump or others will mean he just had a complete field day, but and he's empowered authoritarians all over the world who see that the new president wants to give up on democracy promotion anyway. And what's the issue of Europe? We will leave that till tomorrow. I know that's going to be controversial, but I think the sad thing about this story is that the US had a leadership which had a global reach, a global diplomatic operation, a global message which appeared to appeal. Snowden controversy came along, a whole lot of things, and European angst about America being too powerful there. But it's almost as if the president and the leadership of the US walked into something, whereas Russia, Iran, and to some extent China, that nobody ever talks about, were just waiting. And he walked right into the trap. And now, Trump maybe whatever, but as you rightly say, it's very, very difficult to suddenly turn around and say, "Oh, look what happened in Rwanda. Look what happened in Syria. Look well, now we've got to." There's no support for that. Yeah, and that's rather worrying.
So, Leah, before the next question, Leah, what do you think of this idea that it was all a part of the Great Game?
I think it was a perfect storm of events, and that we can't blame Obama for the outcome. I think his foreign policy in the Middle East was dictated by the outcome of Afghanistan and Iraq, also not helped by the budget crisis and sequestration, and his personality probably, speaking of which, his own personality of and also, Trump has picked up on this too, saying that he wanted, like Trump does want, its security partners to take on more responsibility for their own security. So part of it was a bit of tough love. And we can't be there all the time to fix everything, and also a humility, which is rare for the Americans, but nevertheless that they aren't very good at state building and nation building, and they had no idea what to do in the Middle East, in any of these complex societies, and realized if we go into Syria, it's just going to become, we don't know what we're doing. And so I think Obama wanted to steer clear of that, but what happened was that the security vacuum, 2013 was the time, and he backed away, and a vacuum was created, and it was quickly filled by Iran and Russia, China, Pakistan. Total geostrategic shift in the region that's now gone. It's done.
So I think the last one or two questions.
First of all, I really want to say a little thing about the previous session. We talked about proscription. I think perhaps a caution is necessary, actually, because in a way, proscription also undermines a liberal society, and I think we should be very cautious about endorsing proscriptions too easily, uncritically rather. Talking about Libya, it was an easy little fight, which we won, but also actually it showed us the nature of societies in the Middle East. The sort of a smaller example of the sort of nation states which were established in these places. Libya, with about 4, perhaps 5 million people in a huge landmass, with perhaps one product. As soon as the United States, partners of the United States, Britain and France bombed that place, the place fell apart. And it's going to be very difficult to rebuild that place, actually. Perhaps it doesn't even matter. It doesn't need to be rebuilt because it's so small and it can be contained. The problem with Syria, by the way, unlike Iraq was in some ways, now looking with hindsight, we can say it was a lot easier because the United States had a huge number of partners in that, including Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and almost all the sort of Muslim powers in the region supported United States intervention there. Syria is slightly different. Not only was it a liberal, non-theocratic state, in many ways it was liberal as far as faiths and women were concerned. I mean, it allowed for plurality, which none of the other states allowed for. Even Iraq, perhaps, wasn't as plural as Syria was. Secondly, not all Sunnis in Syria supported the opposition. So the opposition itself was also supported by a very important United States partner, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states.
Do you have a question relating to Syria?
The point I'm making is that actually I'm supporting Obama's non-intervention because I think it would seem to me really wise not to intervene in this quagmire, because I think it may have led to further insurgencies which would have been completely unthought of, really. And one other last point, I don't think it's the end of the American century, actually. I think this is America's perhaps come to terms with itself that it's not the only global power, but it's not the end of the American century. I think that's we'll probably be troubled in the next 4 years with Trumpiana, but I think that will probably not last.
Okay, so if we could take one final question, and then we can wrap up.
I was going to just follow up on the question of the sequence of the interventions that you mentioned, and the positive and the negative sequence that you get. So the Kurdish intervention is positive, at least as intervention in Somalia, which is a disaster from the U.S. perspective. So nobody, the world community skips Rwanda, then feels. Excuse me?
In between that was Haiti.
Yeah, well, there is a Haiti one as well, but it's a little different in terms of what's going on in terms of the intervention. It's not warring parties. And then you have Kosovo, which is success. It leads to a concern with creating R2P, but the United States then makes obviously the disastrous decision in terms of after 9/11, but more importantly with the Iraq War, which cuts back on the etc. So you get Libya, which seems to be a slight success until afterwards. So then you don't go into Syria. Yeah. So I mean, it's a constant question. It's not simply about leadership. The question becomes, how do you factor in the combination of the previous set successes, where the world community is, and the particulars on the ground in terms of what your chances of success, and what your opposition is.
So, Leah, do you think it is like a pendulum, and does that affect how people...
I discussed that in the paper. It's called in literature the rebound effect. So it's well documented that the former experience does have bearing. You know, apparently Bill Clinton went to Rwanda in 1998 and saw, still the lingering disaster, and himself was moved. And then during his administration, they went to Kosovo. Was that the only reason? No, but did it matter? Probably. Did the success or the failure, in Somalia impact Rwanda? Another African, country, another problem? I think it does. And certainly Libya affected Syria, at least from the Security Council point of view, and Russia's resistance, they felt sort of taken advantage of. So certainly this rebound effect is meaningful. And all it does, I think, at the end of the day is reinforce the politicization of the concept, which is fine because we know it is political, but at the end of the day, the implications for human rights in Syria, I think they stand.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're going to wrap up today. We're going to continue tomorrow with the first session being on media and the propaganda war taking place. But I'd like to thank the two panelists we have here. Okay.